begin by commending Peter Biro, one of the best of my former students, for inspiring this conference on such an important theme of democracies under stress. Indeed, we meet at a historical inflection moment where we are witnessing a resurgent global authoritarianism, assault on human rights, illiberal populism, the silence of democracies, the whole as seen through the pain and plight of political prisoners. Accordingly, what I would like to do is share with you 5 case studies of the resurgent global authoritarianism and use political prisoners as the lens, as the looking glass into appreciating not only the pain and plight of the political prisoners, but the global resurgent authoritarianism and its impact on democracies and assault on human rights. The 5 case studies are Mohammed bin Salman's Saudi Arabia through the lens of the political prisoner Raif Badawi, Khamenei's Iran through the lens of the political prisoners, environmentalists, as well as Nasrin Sotoudeh, Maduro's Venezuela through the looking glass of the leader of the democratic opposition, Leopoldo Lopez, Putin's Russia through the lens of Anastasia Shevchenko, and finally, Xi Jinping's China through the looking glass of imprisoned Dr. Wang Bizang. Let me begin with Saudi Arabia. A little over a year ago, our foreign minister, Chrystia Freeland, called for the release of both Raif Badawi, who has been in prison now for 7 years, for saying 7 years ago what the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has himself been saying, namely calling for a more open Saudi Arabia, a more moderate Islam. And for his sister, Samar Badawi, imprisoned for calling for the right to drive, a reform that MBS, to his credit, instituted, but then imprisoned the very women who called for that reform. After Chrystia Freeland tweeted her call for the release of the Badawis, the authorities in Saudi Arabia literally erupted with fury. They recalled their own ambassador from Canada, ejected the Canadian ambassador from Saudi Arabia, suspended all trade and investment with Canada, and recalled some 15,000 Saudi students studying in Canada, along with senior medical fellows here. In effect, an initiative as self-defeating as it was rights violating. What happened after that, however, and which relates to our theme today, was most disturbing. Not one democracy came to Canada's defense. And indeed, the silence of the democracies may be said to have led us down the road to the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi some 2 months later. In other words, the silence of the democracies only served to embolden the Saudi leadership to believe that they could continue to behave with impunity. The brutal murder of Khashoggi 1 year ago finally served, however belatedly, as a wake-up call for the international community. Condemnatory resolutions were passed in the House and Senate. Indeed, I went to the House and Senate together with Raif Badawi's wife, Ensaf Heder, and it's important to point out that Raif Badawi's wife and 3 children are citizens of Canada. And we went to the US, went to the European Parliament, sought to raise the case and cause and pain and plight of the Badawis. And after the brutal murder of Khashoggi, this did serve as a wake-up call. and condemnatory resolutions I mentioned were passed. However, here too, the admonition had begun to abate. And whereas the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Extrajudicial Execution, Agnes Callamard, with whom I met recently, found that there was credible evidence that the senior leadership in Saudi Arabia was responsible for that brutal murder of Khashoggi. Nonetheless, Saudi Arabia was recently elected to chair the group of 20. So rather than being held accountable, they in effect were rewarded for the imprisonment of the Badawis and others, where today Saudi Arabia is the fourth leading jailer of journalists all over the world, and leading women human rights defenders continue to languish in prison, some of them tortured in detention as we meet. Which brings me now to Khamenei's Iran. And I use that term to distinguish it from the people and publics in Iran who are otherwise the targets of mass domestic repression. In December 2018, our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights released a report called Realizing Rights Over Repression in Iran, which sought to detail and document the assault on human rights in Iran, where 2018, as Amnesty International and others have put it, was a year of shame, a year of almost unprecedented assault on human rights in Iran, assault on women's rights, assault on environmentalist rights, where the protection of the environment became a capital offense, assault on journalists, on trade union leaders. Indeed, the arrest and imprisonment and torture and detention and sometimes execution of the broad spectrum of human rights defenders in Iran. In 2019, this assault, this relentless assault on human rights in Iran has not only continued, but has in fact intensified. In August alone, 9 women were sentenced to 109 years in prison for doing nothing else other than seeking to remove their hijab, a fundamental assault on women's rights and women's choice. The whole underpinned by a continuing legalized gender apartheid in Iran. 8 leading members of the Persian Wildlife Heritage Foundation, a leading environmental protection group in Iran, continue to languish in prison, some of them tortured in detention for doing nothing other than seeking to protect ancient species in Iran, protecting the environment in Iran, for which they have been sentenced under national security charges and now risk even execution. And perhaps a leading case study, a lens through which the pain and plight of the assault on human rights in Iran can be seen, is the case and cause of Nasrin Sotoudeh, an iconic women human rights lawyer in Iran, who has gone down the line in Iran to protect other women, to protect journalists, to protect other political prisoners, to protect juveniles destined for execution, until she herself has become a political prisoner, where a woman in her mid-50s was sentenced to 38 years in prison and 148 lashes, a virtual death sentence accompanied by brutal torture. And so in Khamenei's Iran today, we are not only witnessing this relentless assault on human rights, of which Nasrin Sotoudeh is a dramatic case study, but where impunity is in fact rewarded. It is now, at this point, since 31 years, since the mass executions of dissidents in Iran in 1988. But not only have none of them involved in those executions and the senior ones involved in those executions, the organization of the death squads, been brought to justice, but they have been rewarded for their criminality. To give you just two examples, the former Minister of Justice in Iran was himself one of the leaders of the death squads. The now Chief Justice Raisi in Iran was one of the leaders of the death squads. So not only do we have this relentless assault on human rights, where there's no accountability, where impunity continues, but in fact, that impunity is even rewarded. Which brings me now to Maduro's Venezuela. Some 2 years ago, I was one of 3 jurists appointed to an independent panel, as it was called, of legal experts to look into whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity are being committed in Venezuela. After a sustained inquiry on our part, investigating through the written testimony and personal witness testimony, we came to the determination that 7 major crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela. Multiple murders, thousands of cases of arbitrary arrest and imprisonment, torture, disappearances, persecution on political grounds, and perhaps the worst of all, state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, the weaponization of food and medicine, the dramatic increase of 60% in maternal mortality and 30% in infant mortality, the reappearance of diseases long ago eradicated, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and the like. And here too, the whole amidst a culture of impunity. During our hearings, we had a looking glass into this state-sanctioned assault on human rights, the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and the like. Renata Tovar, who escaped from Venezuela, has come to Canada to seek refugee status here, testified how she had been ordered by the Maduro regime to issue a false arrest warrant against the then Democratic leader of the opposition in Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez. The prosecutor in Lopez's case, Franklin Neves, who managed to escape from Venezuela and appeared before our Commission of Inquiry, also testified that he had been ordered to levy trumped-up criminal charges against Leopoldo Lopez. And we had witnesses who testified before us that they were tortured to issue false confessions against Lopez. And so what we have here is a looking glass into the pain and plight of political prisoners in Venezuela, reflecting and representing the wholesale assault on human rights, the rule of law, an independent judiciary, and the like, and the crimes against humanity that continue to be committed as we meet. Fortunately here, and Canada is to be commended in this regard, because it led a group of nations in making the first ever collective referral of crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court in The Hague a year ago. Yet a year later, an investigation by the ICC has yet to begin, and the state-orchestrated crimes against humanity are tragically continuing, where the people of the Venezuela are the targeted victims, such that as we meet, we are witness to the largest exodus of Venezuelans in the history of Latin America, the largest exodus of refugees in Latin America, over 4 million that have left Venezuela, this too contributing to destabilizing fallout in such neighboring countries as Colombia. Which brings me now to Putin's Russia, where, while we are mindful of the manner in which Putin's Russia has been threatening democracies abroad, and that too contributes to democracies under stress, we have not been as aware of the domestic repression at home. We are not as aware of the fact that there's been a 6-fold increase in political prisoners in Russia in the last 4 years alone. We are not aware of the criminalization of fundamental freedoms in Russia, a freedom of speech, of assembly, of association, of the criminalization of democracy, where Anastasia Shevchenko has become the first political prisoner under Russia's recently enacted foreign registration law, which makes those engaged in democratic pursuing NGOs like Open Russia, as Anastasia Shevchenko was doing, becoming political prisoners. And now, finally, to Xi Jinping's China, where we have been witness here to massive repressions both within China and threatening here too abroad, where we have seen close to 1 million Uyghurs being held in arbitrary detention, the continuing repression of Tibetans, the prosecution and persecution of the Falun Gong, and the illegal harvesting of organs, the increase here too in political prisoners and criminalization of fundamental rights. The whole, as can be seen through the looking glass of Dr. Wang Bizang, and here too a political prisoner with a Canadian connection. Dr. Wang Bizang came to Canada in 1979, a doctor from China, to pursue doctoral studies at McGill University, graduating with a PhD in 1982. At the time, however, he decided, yes, it was important to be a doctor, but even more important, to seek to promote democracy in China. And so he established the Overseas Chinese Democracy Movement. Fast forward to 2002, he was visiting Vietnam with some colleagues, where he was abducted by Chinese authorities from Vietnam, brought back to China, and tried and convicted of both the charges of terrorism and treason in a sham trial of several hours, and sentenced to life imprisonment in solitary confinement, where he has suffered a series of debilitating strokes in prison. His daughter, Tiana Wang, named after Tiananmen Square, recently graduated herself from McGill Law School, had been refused for years the right to just visit her father in prison. Finally, recently, she got permission to go together with her newly born son. But they went to China at a time of the intentions, as we know now, because of Canada's fulfillment of its extradition treaty obligations with the U.S. and the arrest, as we meet, of the leader in China of one of the technology corporations who has been accused of passing state secrets with respect to Iran. And so she went to China at a time of tension between the relations between China and Canada, and there was admittedly some risk in her making the visit, but she had received a visa to do so. However, on arriving in China, she was not allowed to see her father, together with her infant son, was put on a plane to South Korea to go back to Canada. That plane, on its way back to Canada, happened to land in Beijing, where Beijing authorities boarded the plane, took her off with her infant son, jailed her, and only after an outcry was she released. But as we meet, Dr. Wang Bizang continues to languish in a Chinese prison. The culture of impunity continues to reign there, and the cruelty reflected in the treatment of Tiana Wang, not to speak of what I referenced earlier in the pain and plight of the Uyghurs, Falun Gong, and the like. And so the question becomes, what can we do? What can democracies, under stress, under threats from without and within, do? The first thing is, we must combat the resurgent global authoritarianisms, combat the cultures of criminality and corruption and the impunity that underpins them, and hold the human rights violators to account, and impose Magnitsky sanctions on these human rights violators, which would include visa bans, acid freezes, so at least we will protect Canada from the export of these violations and violators abroad, while holding them accountable for their complicity and criminality in the violations in their respective countries. So that's the first thing, imposition of Magnitsky sanctions. And I would just like to mention here, parenthetically, that when we released our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights last December, our report on the massive repression in Iran, we identified 19 major architects of repression, as we call them, in Khamenei's Iran. And we called for Magnitsky sanctions to be issued with respect to these 19 architects of repression. As we meet to date, those sanctions have yet to be imposed. But we need to act, and this is the first objective, to sanction human rights violators in Iran and in other of the resurgent global authoritarians that I've mentioned, though that has been done in the matter of Maduro's Venezuela, for example. Second major responsibility here, and that is to promote and protect the values, the institutions of our democracies. Yes, as the theme of this conference has put it, democracies are under threat. Indeed, the Prague Declaration on Democratic Renewal, some 2.5 years ago, made the following compelling statement. As they put it, democracies everywhere are under threat, and all of us who care about democracy must come to its defense. And they described how democracies are threatened from without and from within. And we need to stand up for the values, the institutions in the promotion and protection of democracies. The third is to stand up on behalf of political prisoners whose pain and plight I've sought to summarize today. To stand in solidarity with those who have been putting not only their livelihood, but their lives on the line for the very values that we seek to universally embrace with them. They represent the criminalization of fundamental freedoms. They represent the arrest and imprisonment and torture in detention and sometimes execution of those who seek to promote and protect these freedoms. And so we should stand together with the Badawis in Saudi Arabia, Nasrin Sotoudeh in Iran, Leopoldo Lopez's of Venezuela, the Anastasia Shevchenkos of Russia, the Wang Bizangs of China. Stand with them, let them know that they are not alone, that we will be ourselves relentless in our advocacy for their release, as they have been relentless in their advocacy for the promotion and protection of democratic freedoms. A third or fourth objective that we should seek at this point has to do with the promotion and protection of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We are the people of the Charter in the age of the Charter, working to protect the Charter. Our former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Antonio Lamer, said on the 10th anniversary of the Canadian Charter of the Rights and Freedoms that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was a revolutionary act, no less revolutionary, as he put it, than the discovery of Pasteur in science. If it is a revolutionary act on behalf of the promotion and protection of our rights and freedoms, then we have to be engaged in our democracy under stress, threatened from without and from within, to promote and protect these fundamental freedoms, amongst which is the fundamental freedom of expression, which is a pillar of our constitutional democracy. And here too, as we meet, journalists are under threat as never before. More journalists were murdered in 2018 than in any other previous year of the last decade. Journalists are under assault at this point. We see more journalists arrested, imprisoned, harassed, and the like than ever before. And so, as part of our promotion and protection of fundamental rights, we must stand with those who are seeking to promote and protect freedom of expression. As I said, a pillar of our democracy, and it is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that underpin our democracy, and it behooves us all to best respond to the theme of democracies under stress, to be the promoters and protectors of democracies under stress, both from within and without, to hold the resurgent global authoritarians to account as we promote and protect our democracies at home.